Commander Jake Mitchell had seen it all during his 15 years with the Navy SEALs. From the scorching deserts of Afghanistan to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, he had led countless missions that would make ordinary men's blood run cold. His weathered face bore the marks of a warrior who had stared death in the eye more times than he cared to count. The scars on his hands told stories of close calls, while his steady gray eyes reflected the wisdom that comes only from surviving the impossible. On this particular morning in Norfolk, Virginia, Jake was preparing his team for what promised to be one of the most challenging training exercises of the year. The facility buzzed with nervous energy as 30 elite soldiers checked their equipment one final time. These weren't ordinary servicemen. They were the cream of the crop, handpicked from thousands of candidates who had dreamed of wearing the SEAL insignia. Each man had already proven himself in ways that would humble most people, yet today they looked to Jake with the same respect and attention they had shown since day one of their brutal training. The exercise was designed to test their ability to work alongside international special forces units. In an increasingly connected world, American SEALs often found themselves operating shoulder to shoulder with elite soldiers from allied nations. Today's training would simulate a joint operation with members of the British Special Air Service, the German KSK, and most notably, 2 members of the Queen's Guard who had been specially selected for their exceptional combat skills beyond their ceremonial duties. Jake had worked with international forces before, but something felt different about today's group. As he watched the foreign soldiers arrive at the compound, he noticed the way they carried themselves, not with the swagger of men trying to prove something, but with the quiet confidence of professionals who had nothing to prove to anyone. The British SAS members moved with the fluid precision he expected, while the Germans displayed their characteristic methodical preparation. But it was the 2 Royal Guards who caught his attention immediately. Unlike their colleagues, who arrived in standard military fatigues, these men wore modified versions of their traditional uniforms, adapted for tactical operations. Their red tunics had been replaced with practical combat gear, yet they maintained an unmistakable air of ceremony and tradition that set them apart from every other soldier in the compound. The taller of the 2, a man who appeared to be in his early 30s with piercing blue eyes and perfectly groomed dark hair, commanded attention without saying a word. Jake approached the international team to introduce himself and brief them on the day's objectives. As he shook hands with each soldier, he made mental notes about their demeanor, their equipment, and their apparent level of readiness. The SAS captain was exactly what he expected: professional, direct, and clearly experienced. The German operators were methodical in their responses, asking precise questions about the exercise parameters and safety protocols. When Jake reached the 1st Royal Guard, the man's grip was firm and his introduction crisp and professional. "Sergeant William Thompson, Your Majesty's Guard," he said with a slight British accent that suggested education and refinement. There was something about Thompson that immediately commanded respect. Perhaps it was the way he stood perfectly straight without appearing stiff, or the way his eyes seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings while maintaining direct eye contact during conversation. The 2nd Royal Guard introduced himself as Corporal David Hayes, a slightly younger man with sandy brown hair and a quiet intensity that reminded Jake of his best snipers. Both men answered Jake's preliminary questions with the kind of precision and attention to detail that spoke of extensive training beyond what most people associated with the ceremonial aspects of their roles. They were clearly combat-ready soldiers who happened to serve in one of the world's most visible ceremonial positions. As Jake outlined the training scenario, he explained that they would be conducting a simulated hostage rescue operation in an urban environment. The exercise would test their ability to coordinate movements, communicate across language barriers, and adapt to unexpected complications that the training staff would introduce throughout the day. Each team would be equipped with non-lethal training weapons, protective gear, and communication equipment that would allow the instructors to monitor their performance in real time. The facility they would be using was a mock city that had been constructed specifically for this type of training. Complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and realistic urban obstacles, it provided an environment that closely mimicked the challenges they might face in actual operations. Hidden cameras and sensors throughout the area would track their movements and record their decision-making processes for later review and analysis. Jake noticed that Sergeant Thompson asked several thoughtful questions about the rules of engagement and the protocols for civilian casualties, even in a training environment. His questions demonstrated not just tactical knowledge, but a deep understanding of the moral and legal complexities that modern soldiers faced in combat situations. This wasn't a man who saw military action as a game or an adventure. This was someone who understood the weight of responsibility that came with the power to take lives. As the briefing concluded and the teams began their final equipment checks, Jake felt a familiar surge of anticipation. These joint exercises always revealed interesting dynamics between different military cultures and training philosophies. He had learned valuable lessons from soldiers of many nations, and today promised to offer new insights into how tradition and modernity could coexist in military excellence. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting sharp shadows across the training compound as the teams prepared to enter the mock urban environment. Jake's instincts, honed by years of combat leadership, told him that today would be memorable for reasons he couldn't yet identify. Something about the presence of these royal guards suggested that this exercise would challenge his assumptions about ceremonial soldiers and reveal truths about honor, duty, and sacrifice that went far deeper than anyone expected. The exercise began with the sharp blast of an air horn that echoed across the training compound. Jake's team moved into the mock city with the practiced efficiency that had made them legendary among Special Forces units worldwide. Their movements were fluid and coordinated, each man knowing instinctively where his teammates would be and what they would be doing at any given moment. Years of training and real-world operations had forged them into something more than a group of individual soldiers. They were a single organism with multiple parts, each part perfectly synchronized with the others. As they advanced through the narrow streets of the artificial urban environment, Jake kept one eye on his own team's performance and another on their international partners. The British SAS moved with their characteristic blend of aggression and precision, clearing buildings with a methodical efficiency that spoke of extensive urban warfare experience. The German KSK operators displayed their legendary attention to detail, checking every corner and potential hiding spot with thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. But it was the two royal guards who surprised everyone. Instead of the ceremonial stiffness that many had expected, Sergeant Thompson and Corporal Hayes moved through the urban terrain with a grace and efficiency that rivaled the most experienced special operations soldiers. Thompson took point for his small unit, his movements economical and purposeful as he navigated the maze of buildings and alleyways. Hayes provided overwatch from elevated positions, his ability to quickly identify optimal firing positions, suggesting extensive training in urban sniper tactics. The first phase of the exercise involved locating and securing a simulated chemical weapons cache that had been hidden somewhere in the mock city. Intelligence briefings had provided general location parameters, but the exact position would require systematic searching and the kind of intuitive tactical thinking that separated elite soldiers from ordinary troops. Jake watched as the various teams spread out to cover their assigned sectors, each group bringing their own cultural approach to the problem. His own SEAL team approached the task with their characteristic adaptability, using a combination of high-tech surveillance equipment and old-fashioned fieldcraft to narrow down the possible locations. The SAS team relied heavily on their extensive urban warfare doctrine, methodically clearing buildings according to well-established protocols. The German operators used their analytical approach, creating detailed maps of their search areas. and tracking their progress with almost scientific precision. Thompson's approach was different from any of them. Jake noticed that the Royal Guard sergeant seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to read the urban environment, identifying likely hiding spots not through systematic searching, but through an intuitive understanding of how people think and behave under pressure. When Thompson paused outside a seemingly ordinary warehouse and signaled for his team to prepare for entry, Jake found himself drawn closer to observe. The warehouse appeared to be one of dozens of similar buildings, scattered throughout the training facility. Nothing about its external appearance suggested it was more significant than any other structure in the area, but Thompson had picked up on subtle indicators that others had missed. The way dust patterns had been disturbed around the entrance, the positioning of seemingly random debris that might have been arranged to discourage casual investigation, and most tellingly, the faint chemical odor that was barely detectable but unmistakably artificial. As Thompson's team prepared to breach the warehouse, Jake positioned himself where he could observe their tactics without interfering with the exercise. What he saw impressed him more than anything he had witnessed in recent memory. The Royal Guards moved with a coordination and efficiency that seemed almost choreographed, yet maintained the flexibility to adapt instantly to unexpected developments. Their communication was minimal but perfectly timed, each man understanding his role without need for extensive verbal coordination. Hayes had positioned himself to cover the warehouse from an elevated position across the street, his rifle trained on potential escape routes while maintaining overwatch on his sergeant's approach. Thompson signaled his intentions with subtle hand gestures that spoke of countless hours of practice, then moved to breach the warehouse entrance with a combination of speed and caution that balanced urgency with tactical prudence. The breach itself was textbook perfect. Thompson used a controlled explosive charge to blow the lock, then immediately moved aside to allow the concussion to dissipate before entering. His follow-up movement was smooth and professional, weapon-ready but not overly aggressive. Eyes scanning for threats while remaining aware of potential civilian casualties. Within seconds, he had cleared the immediate entry area and signaled for Hayes to adjust his position to cover the warehouse interior. Jake found himself holding his breath as Thompson disappeared into the shadowy interior of the building. The training exercise was designed to be challenging but safe, with multiple safety protocols and oversight systems in place to prevent accidents. Yet something about the intensity and professionalism of Thompson's approach made the simulation feel more real than any training Jake had experienced in years. Minutes passed with no communication from inside the warehouse. Jake began to wonder if Thompson had encountered one of the complications that the training staff had planned, or if something had gone wrong with his equipment. Just as Jake was considering whether to check on the situation, Thompson's voice came through the communication system with calm professionalism that would have made his drill instructors proud. "Cache located and secured," Thompson reported. "No complications, no casualties. Ready for Phase 2. The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the other teams, who had been systematically working through their assigned sectors without success. Jake felt a grudging admiration for Thompson's instincts and tactical skills, combined with curiosity about where exactly a Royal Guard had acquired such impressive urban warfare capabilities. The man's personnel file had mentioned combat deployments, but the level of skill he was displaying suggested far more extensive experience than most people associated with ceremonial duties. As the exercise moved into its second phase, Jake found himself paying closer attention to both Royal Guards. Their performance in the first phase had been impressive, but he wanted to see how they would handle the more complex challenges that lay ahead. The next stage would involve a simulated hostage rescue operation that would test not just their tactical skills, but their ability to make split-second decisions under pressure while minimizing risk to innocent civilians. The second phase of the exercise brought an unexpected intensity that caught even Jake's experienced team off guard. The scenario had evolved into a complex hostage situation involving multiple buildings, civilian actors playing the roles of innocent bystanders, and a sophisticated enemy force that had been given permission to adapt their tactics in real time. What had begun as a standard training exercise was becoming something that felt increasingly like actual combat operations. Jake's radio crackled with reports from various team leaders as they repositioned their units to respond to the new threat scenario. The exercise controllers had introduced a wrinkle that none of the teams had anticipated. The simulated terrorists had split their hostages between two different locations, forcing the international force to divide their attention and coordinate simultaneous operations across the mock urban environment. From his command position, Jake could see that the situation was testing everyone's ability to think on their feet and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The SAS team was regrouping to assault the primary target building, while the German operators were establishing overwatch positions to prevent the terrorists from moving their hostages to new locations. His own SEAL team was preparing to breach the secondary site, where intelligence suggested a smaller number of hostages were being held. But it was the Royal Guards who found themselves in perhaps the most challenging position of all. Thompson and Hayes had been assigned to provide reconnaissance and security for the entire operation, which meant they needed to move freely throughout the urban environment while maintaining awareness of all the other teams' positions and activities. It was a role that required not just tactical skill, but the kind of situational awareness and decision-making ability that came only from extensive combat experience. Jake watched through his binoculars as Thompson moved through the narrow alleyways. Between buildings, his movements purposeful but cautious. The Royal Guard sergeant was clearly gathering intelligence about enemy positions and movement patterns, information that would be crucial for the success of the coordinated assault. Hayes had taken position on a rooftop that provided overwatch for multiple target buildings, his sniper rifle ready to provide cover fire if the situation deteriorated. As Jake observed Thompson's reconnaissance work, he began to notice details about the man's equipment and techniques that raised new questions about his background. Thompson's weapon handling was flawless. But more than that, he seemed to have an intuitive understanding of urban combat tactics that went far beyond what most soldiers learned in basic training. His choice of routes through the mock city showed a deep appreciation for concealment, fields of fire, and escape routes that suggested someone who had spent considerable time in actual combat zones. The assault began with carefully coordinated precision. Jake's SEAL team breached their target building using methods they had perfected through years of real-world operations, moving through the structure with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they could trust their lives to their teammates' skills. The SAS team struck their target simultaneously, their approach slightly more aggressive, but equally professional. Both assaults proceeded smoothly until the exercise controllers introduced another complication. Simulated civilians began emerging from buildings throughout the area, creating a chaotic environment where identifying friend from foe became exponentially more difficult. The scenario was designed to test the soldiers' ability to maintain fire discipline and make split-second decisions about when to shoot and when to hold fire. Jake found himself impressed by how all the teams handled the additional complexity, but it was Thompson's response that truly caught his attention. Rather than focusing solely on his assigned reconnaissance mission, the Royal Guard sergeant had positioned himself where he could observe the civilian evacuation routes and provide early warning if any of the actors playing terrorists tried to blend in with the fleeing civilians. Thompson's voice came through the radio system with calm authority as he provided real-time intelligence to all the assault teams. Overwatch to all teams. Be advised 3 military-age males moving east on Baker Street, attempting to blend with civilian evacuation. Recommend intercept at grid reference Delta 4. The information proved accurate, and within minutes the designated personnel were detained by one of the roving security teams. Jake made a mental note about Thompson's ability to distinguish between genuine civilians and potential threats in a chaotic environment, a skill that was absolutely critical in modern urban warfare, but notoriously difficult to teach in training. Scenarios. As the exercise continued, Jake began to pay closer attention to the small details of Thompson's performance. The Royal Guard's radio communications were consistently professional and informative, providing exactly the right amount of information at the right time without cluttering the communication channels. His movement through the urban environment showed an awareness of cover and concealment that suggested someone who had learned these lessons under fire rather than in a classroom. But it was Thompson's interaction with the civilian actors that really impressed Jake. When a group of civilians became confused about evacuation procedures and started moving toward a danger area, Thompson emerged from concealment to guide them to safety. His approach was calm but authoritative, and Jake noticed that he seemed to have a natural ability to reassure frightened people while maintaining his tactical awareness of potential threats. The way Thompson handled his weapon during this civilian interaction was particularly noteworthy. He kept his rifle in a ready position but not directly threatening, maintaining the ability to respond instantly to danger while not appearing overly aggressive to the frightened civilians. It was a delicate balance that many soldiers struggled with, but Thompson seemed to manage it effortlessly. Hayes, from his overwatch position, was providing equally impressive support. His communications were crisp and professional, and his ability to track multiple moving targets simultaneously while maintaining overwatch for the assault teams demonstrated exceptional skill and experience. Jake had worked with many snipers over the years, and Hayes' performance ranked among the best he had ever observed. As the hostage rescue operations neared their conclusion, Jake found himself genuinely curious about where these Royal Guards had acquired their obviously extensive combat experience. Their personnel files had mentioned deployments, but the level of tactical sophistication they were displaying suggested far more significant involvement in actual combat operations than most people would associate with ceremonial guard duties. There was clearly more to both men than their traditional red tunics and bearskin hats would suggest. The final phase of the training exercise brought an unexpected twist that would test every participant's ability to handle the kind of moral complexity that characterized modern warfare. The exercise controllers announced that intelligence had revealed the presence of a high-value target among the remaining terrorists, someone whose capture could provide critical information about future attacks. However, the target was wounded and in need of immediate medical attention, creating a dilemma about priorities and resource allocation. Jake felt his pulse quicken as the scenario unfolded. These kinds of ethical challenges were among the most difficult aspects of special operations work, requiring split-second decisions that could have far-reaching consequences. The easy choice would be to focus solely on neutralizing the threat and securing the area, but the potential intelligence value of a live capture made the situation far more complex. As the various teams repositioned to respond to this new development, Jake noticed that Thompson had moved to a position where he could observe the building where the high-value target was reportedly located. From his vantage point, the Royal Guard sergeant would be able to provide crucial intelligence about enemy movements and defensive positions, but he would also be exposed to significant risk if the situation deteriorated quickly. Through his communication system, Jake could hear Thompson providing calm, professional updates about what he was observing. The Royal Guard's reports were detailed and accurate, describing the number of defenders, their apparent equipment and training level, and most importantly, their likely response to different assault approaches. It was clear that Thompson had a sophisticated understanding of tactical psychology and could predict how different groups of fighters would react under pressure. Hayes had repositioned his sniper rifle to provide overwatch for Thompson's exposed position while maintaining the ability to support the main assault if needed. The coordination between the two Royal Guards was seamless, with minimal verbal communication but perfect understanding of each other's intentions and capabilities. Jake had seen this kind of partnership before, usually between soldiers who had served together through multiple combat deployments and learned to trust each other completely. The assault on the final target building began with Thompson providing real-time intelligence about defender positions and movements. His observations allowed the assault teams to approach from unexpected angles and avoid several defensive positions that could have caused significant casualties in a real-world scenario. Jake found himself genuinely impressed by Thompson's ability to read the tactical situation and provide information that directly contributed to mission success. As the assault teams moved into position, Jake decided to get closer to the action so he could observe the final phase of the exercise more directly. Moving through the mock urban environment, he positioned himself where he could see Thompson's overwatch position and observe how the Royal Guard handled the stress and complexity of the evolving situation. What Jake saw reinforced his growing respect for Thompson's tactical abilities. The Royal Guard sergeant was completely focused on his mission, providing precise updates about enemy movements while maintaining awareness of friendly force positions to prevent fratricide incidents. His voice remained calm and professional despite the obvious stress of the situation, and his tactical recommendations showed a deep understanding of urban warfare principles. The breakthrough came when Thompson identified a weakness in the defender's position that the assault teams could exploit. Rather than simply reporting what he observed, Thompson provided a specific tactical recommendation that would allow the teams to approach the high-value target's location while minimizing risk to both the hostages and the wounded terrorist they needed to capture alive. Jake watched as Thompson's recommendation was implemented with precision and effectiveness. The assault teams moved according to his guidance, approaching the target building from an angle that the defenders hadn't adequately covered. Within minutes, they had secured the area and captured the high-value target alive, along with rescuing the remaining hostages without casualties. As the exercise concluded and the various teams began their equipment recovery and debriefing procedures, Jake found himself drawn to approach Thompson directly. There were questions about the Royal Guard's background and experience that he needed answered, not from official curiosity, but from professional respect for someone whose tactical skills had genuinely impressed him. Thompson was methodically checking his equipment and preparing for the formal debriefing when Jake approached. Up close, Jake could see details about the Royal Guard's gear and personal equipment that he had missed from a distance. Thompson's rifle was well maintained, but showed signs of extensive use, with small modifications that suggested someone who had customized it based on actual combat experience. His tactical gear was similarly professional, with the kind of practical additions and modifications that came from learning what worked under fire. But it was Thompson's uniform that caught Jake's attention most strongly. As the Royal Guard removed his tactical vest and began organizing his equipment, Jake could see that his combat fatigues bore patches and insignia that told a story of extensive military service far beyond ceremonial duties. There were deployment patches from Afghanistan and Iraq, qualification badges for airborne and special operations training, and other indicators of a military career that had involved significant combat experience. Most intriguingly, Jake noticed what appeared to be a faded tattoo on Thompson's forearm, partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. The design was partially obscured, but Jake could make out enough detail to recognize military symbolism that suggested association with elite units. The tattoo appeared to incorporate elements that Jake associated with British Special Forces, but there were other symbols that he couldn't immediately identify. As Jake continued to observe Thompson's post-exercise routine, he began to piece together a picture of someone whose official role as a Royal Guard represented only a small part of his actual military experience and capabilities. The man's tactical skills, leadership abilities, and combat experience clearly extended far beyond what anyone would expect from someone whose primary duty involved standing guard at royal palaces and participating in ceremonial events. Thompson seemed to sense Jake's attention and looked up from his equipment with a slight smile. "Interesting exercise, Commander," he said in his crisp British accent. "Your teams performed admirably under pressure. It's always instructive to work with American Special Operations units." Jake nodded, still processing what he had observed. Throughout the day, You and Hayes showed some impressive skills out there, Sergeant. That reconnaissance work was textbook perfect, and your tactical recommendations were spot on. Where did you pick up that level of urban warfare training? Thompson's response to Jake's question was measured and professional, but there was something in his eyes that suggested depths of experience that went far beyond what he was willing to discuss in casual conversation. The Guard requires a diverse range of skills, Commander. Our ceremonial duties are only part of what we do. Jake sensed that there was much more to the story, but he also recognized the careful way Thompson had phrased his response. Military. Personnel often spoke in such measured terms when discussing classified or sensitive aspects of their service, and Jake respected the boundaries that professional discretion required. However, his curiosity about Thompson's background had only intensified throughout the day's exercise. As the formal debriefing session began, Jake found himself paying close attention to how Thompson and Hayes interacted with the other participants. Both Royal Guards contributed thoughtful observations about the exercise, offering insights that demonstrated not just tactical knowledge, but strategic thinking about how different approaches to urban warfare could be improved and refined. Their comments showed the kind of analytical thinking that came from extensive experience in actual combat situations. During the discussion of the final phase of the exercise, Thompson provided a detailed analysis of how the terrorist defenders had positioned themselves and why certain tactical approaches had been more effective than others. His observations were sophisticated and nuanced, showing an understanding of human psychology under stress that impressed even the most experienced special operations veterans in the room. Hayes contributed equally valuable insights about Overwatch procedures, and the challenges of providing sniper support in complex urban environments with multiple friendly forces operating simultaneously. His comments revealed an understanding of precision shooting under pressure that clearly came from real-world experience, rather than just training scenarios. As the debriefing continued, Jake noticed several subtle interactions between Thompson and Hayes that reinforced his impression that these men had worked together extensively in high-stress situations. They communicated with glances and small gestures that spoke of perfect understanding and complete trust in each other's abilities. It was the kind of partnership that Jake had seen among his most experienced SEAL teams, but rarely among soldiers from different units or backgrounds. When the formal debriefing concluded, Jake lingered as the various participants began to disperse. He was hoping for an opportunity to continue his conversation with Thompson in a more informal setting, perhaps over drinks at the officers' club where military personnel often shared stories and experiences that they wouldn't discuss in official settings. Thompson seemed to anticipate Jake's intentions and approached him as the conference room emptied. "Commander, I wonder if you might join Hayes and myself for a drink this evening. There are aspects of today's exercise that might benefit from further discussion, and I suspect you have questions about our background that discretion prevented me from addressing earlier." Jake accepted the invitation immediately, intrigued by Thompson's suggestion that there was more to discuss and that he might be willing to share information that hadn't been appropriate for the formal debriefing. As they made arrangements to meet later that evening, Jake found himself genuinely excited about the prospect of learning more about these remarkable Royal Guards and their obviously extensive combat experience. The Officers' Club that evening provided a relaxed atmosphere where military personnel could unwind and share experiences without the formal constraints of official duties. Jake arrived to find Thompson and Hayes already seated at a quiet corner table, having changed from their military uniforms into civilian clothes that somehow made them appear even more like the combat veterans Jake suspected them to be. Thompson had ordered drinks for all three men and gestured for Jake to join them. As Jake settled into his chair, he noticed that both Royal Guards appeared more relaxed than they had during the day's exercise, but there was still an alertness about them that suggested men who never completely let their guard down, even in safe environments. "Commander," Thompson began, "I believe you've been curious about our background and training. Hayes and I have discussed it, and we think you deserve some answers after the professional respect you showed us today." Jake nodded, his curiosity intensified by Thompson's formal tone and the suggestion that what he was about to learn might be sensitive information. Thompson took a sip of his drink and seemed to consider his words carefully. "The truth is that our service with the Royal Guard represents only a part of our military careers. Both Hayes and I have extensive backgrounds with British Special Forces units, including deployments that took us far from the ceremonial duties that most people associate with our current positions." Hayes spoke for the first time since Jake had joined them, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of someone who had seen significant combat action. "We've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other locations that aren't generally discussed in public. Our assignment to the Royal Guard came after these deployments, partly as recognition for our service and partly because our experience provides additional capabilities that aren't always visible to the public." Jake felt his understanding of the situation beginning to shift, as he realized that these men weren't just ceremonial soldiers who had received some combat training, but rather experienced special forces operators who happened to serve in highly visible ceremonial roles. The implications of this revelation were significant, suggesting that the Royal Guard included personnel with far more diverse and sophisticated capabilities than most people realized. Thompson continued the explanation, his tone remaining measured but becoming more personal. "The tattoo you noticed earlier, Commander. It tells a story that most people aren't meant to read. Hayes and I earned our place in the Guard through service that took us places and required us to do things that don't fit with the public image of men in red tunics standing outside palaces." As Thompson spoke, he rolled up his sleeve to reveal the tattoo that Jake had glimpsed earlier. What Jake saw left him speechless, unable to process the implications of what he was looking at. The tattoo on Thompson's forearm was unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. It wasn't the typical military insignia or unit badge that soldiers often wore with pride. Instead, it was an intricate design that combined symbols from multiple elite military units. But at its center was something that made Jake's blood run cold with recognition and disbelief. Embedded within the artistic design was a small, precise representation of the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valor in combat. But surrounding it were symbols that Jake recognized from some of the most classified special operations units in the world. There were elements that suggested service with the Special Air Service, but also indicators of involvement with units, so secret that their existence was rarely acknowledged even within military circles. Jake stared at the tattoo in stunned silence, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The Victoria Cross was Britain's equivalent to the Medal of Honor, a decoration so rare and prestigious that fewer than 1,500 had been awarded since its creation in 1856. To see one represented in a tattoo suggested not just exceptional bravery, but actions so extraordinary that they had been recognized at the highest levels of the British military. Thompson noticed Jake's expression and spoke quietly, his voice carrying a weight that Jake now understood came from experiences that few people could imagine. "The tattoo represents a mission that officially never happened, Commander. Hayes and I were part of a joint operation with American Special Forces in Afghanistan, an operation that saved the lives of an entire village but required us to exceed our official authority and rules of engagement." Hayes continued the story, his voice equally quiet but intense. "We were supposed to provide reconnaissance for a larger operation, but we discovered that intelligence had been wrong about the timeline. Terrorist forces were already moving to massacre civilians, including women and children, hours before the main assault force could arrive. We had a choice: follow orders and watch innocents die, or act on our own authority and save lives." Jake felt his throat tighten as he began to understand the magnitude of what these men had done. The scenario they described was every special operations soldier's nightmare, a situation where following orders meant allowing atrocities to occur, but taking unauthorized action could result in court-martial and the end of military careers. Thompson's voice grew even quieter as he continued the story. Hayes and I, along with 2 American soldiers whose names I won't mention out of respect for their families, decided that some things matter more than careers or regulations. We went in alone, against overwhelming odds, to evacuate that village, before the terrorists arrived. The silence that followed Thompson's words was heavy with the weight of moral complexity that Jake understood all too well. Every special operations soldier faced moments when regulations and reality conflicted, when the right thing to do wasn't necessarily the legal thing to do, and when personal conscience had to override institutional authority. Hayes took over the narrative, his eyes distant as he relived memories that were clearly both painful and meaningful. The operation lasted 18 hours. We evacuated over 200 civilians, mostly women and children, under constant fire from superior forces. We lost one of the Americans, a sergeant whose sacrifice allowed the evacuation to succeed. The other American was severely wounded, but survived. Thompson rolled his sleeve back down, covering the tattoo that told a story of heroism that could never be officially acknowledged. The Victoria Cross was awarded for that action, but the ceremony was private, and the citation remains classified. Officially, we were never there, the village was never in danger, and the evacuation never happened. The families of the people we saved know the truth, but that's not something that appears in any official records. Jake felt overwhelmed by the implications of what he had just learned. These men had risked everything to save innocent lives, had been awarded their nation's highest honor for extraordinary valor, but could never publicly acknowledge their actions because of the classified nature of the operation. They served in one of the world's most visible ceremonial positions, while carrying the secret knowledge of heroism that most people would never understand or appreciate. The revelation also explained everything Jake had observed about Thompson and Hayes during the day's training exercise. Their tactical skills, leadership abilities, and intuitive understanding of combat operations weren't the result of ceremonial training supplemented by some combat experience. They were the capabilities of men who had faced life and death, situations, and made choices that defined them as warriors in the truest sense of the word. Thompson seemed to sense Jake's emotional response and spoke with quiet authority. "We tell you this, Commander, not for recognition or sympathy, but because we recognize in you the same commitment to doing what's right regardless of personal cost. Your reputation among special operations communities is well known, and your leadership today demonstrated the kind of moral courage that we respect." Hayes added his own observation, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "We've worked with many special operations units from different countries, but rarely have we encountered a leader who combines tactical excellence with the kind of ethical foundation that makes difficult decisions possible. Your team follows you not just because you're skilled, but because they trust your judgment about what matters most." As the evening continued, Jake found himself engaged in conversations about leadership, moral courage, and the hidden costs of military service that went far deeper than anything he had expected. Thompson and Hayes shared insights about the psychological challenges of carrying classified knowledge about heroic actions that could never be publicly acknowledged, while Jake offered his own perspectives about the loneliness of command and the weight of making decisions that affected other people's lives. By the time they parted company that evening, Jake had gained not just respect for 2 remarkable soldiers, but a profound understanding of how true heroism often exists in the shadows, unrecognized and unacknowledged by the world at large. The men who stood guard at royal palaces in their ceremonial red uniforms carried within them stories of sacrifice and courage that would never be told in history books or celebrated in public ceremonies. Walking back to his quarters that night, Jake reflected on how his assumptions about ceremonial soldiers had been completely shattered. He had approached the day's exercise expecting to work with competent but inexperienced soldiers whose primary qualifications were related to pageantry and tradition. Instead, he had encountered 2 of the most capable and morally courageous warriors he had ever met, men whose commitment to protecting innocent lives had led them to risk everything in service of principles that transcended military regulations and career considerations. The image of Thompson's tattoo remained burned in Jake's memory, not just as a symbol of extraordinary valor, but as a reminder that true heroism often came at great personal cost. The Victoria. Cross represented not just a moment of exceptional bravery, but a lifetime of carrying the knowledge that doing the right thing sometimes required sacrificing everything that society typically valued. Thompson and Hayes had chosen to save lives over following orders, and while they had been recognized for their courage, they could never publicly share the story of their greatest achievement. Jake understood now why Thompson and Hayes had been selected for the Royal Guard despite their extensive special operations background. Their presence in such a visible ceremonial role served multiple purposes. It honored their service while providing the royal security apparatus with personnel whose capabilities far exceeded what anyone would expect from traditional ceremonial guards. The red uniforms and bearskin hats were simultaneously a reward for extraordinary service and a perfect disguise for continuing that service in a different form. As Jake prepared for sleep that night, he found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he had learned. In special operations communities around the world, there were undoubtedly similar stories of heroism that could never be told, of soldiers who had made impossible choices and lived with the consequences in silence. The men and women who served in the most dangerous and morally complex situations often found themselves isolated by the very experiences that defined their character and commitment. The next morning brought news that would add another layer of meaning to Jake's encounter with the Royal Guards. During breakfast, he received a secure communication informing him that intelligence agencies had identified a terrorist cell planning an attack on a high-profile international event. The preliminary reports suggested that the cell had been inspired by propaganda related to the same terrorist organization that Thompson and Hayes had fought in their classified operation years earlier. Jake realized that the classified mission Thompson and Hayes had described wasn't just a historical event, but part of an ongoing struggle against forces that continued to threaten innocent lives around the world. The village they had saved was just one small victory in a larger war that required the kind of moral courage and tactical excellence that he had witnessed during the previous day's exercise. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself returning frequently.